Hmm. Oh, hello. Is there something you want, darling? Why are you looking at me like that? What is it? You can't sleep? Why can't you sleep? Just because you can't? Oh, that's not a very good reason, is it? Is there something that you wanted from me? You want me to help you go to sleep? And how do you expect me to do that? Normally all I do is keep you awake. And that doesn't seem to be what you want. So, what am I reading? I'm reading some short stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Do you want me to read it to you? Yes? Are you sure? These aren't exactly bedtime stories. I don't want to scare you. No. Then I really would keep you awake. And not in the good way. You want to hear anyway? I think you're just looking for an excuse for me to read to you out loud, instead of hiding in the corner and reading by myself. Is that really what you want? No? That's not what you want? You just want to fall asleep? Okay. Alright, okay. You say so. We'll go over to your bed, and I will read you what I'm reading right now, out loud. And you will fall asleep, won't you? Yes, that's part of the deal. I will read to you and you will fall asleep. Deal? Alright then. Come on. Lay down. Want me to tuck you in? What am I, your mommy? Here you go. There. All tucked in. Is there anything you need? What? Why are you looking at me like that? Do you want a good night kiss? Really? Alright. Here you go. Mwah. Happy? Yes, you look happy. That's good. Okay. I will read to you now, and if you get scared, feel free to interrupt me. It's not that scary. At least, I don't think it's scary at all, but I know you're a little more timid than me. So, we'll see how it goes, alright? This story is called The Black Cat. Right? Ready? You all tucked in? Here we go. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in any case, where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I will unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events, and their consequences. These events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than barracuis. However, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and events. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility of humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous. I'm sorry, I cannot read, apparently. You're distracting me. Alright, I'm sorry. I will go back to reading. Was made ever even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and, in my manhood, I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly to be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute, which goes directly to the heart of him who has frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion, which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted, in this manner, for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend Intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when, by accident, or through affection, they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated, from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when, in his fright at my violence, He inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed, at once, to take its flight from my body, and more than fiendish malevolence, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty, but it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of the creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure than that my soul lives, that I am the perverseness is that I lost my place. That perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties, or sentiments, which gave direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to me to be my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consume the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming down my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense, hung it because I knew that in doing this I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. Oh, darling, you look sad. Are you sure you want me to read this? Are you sure you want me to continue? It's alright, it's just a story. Maybe. Here. Better? Yeah. I know you like cats, darling. Yeah, I know you do. It's alright. I can stop if you want me to. I can stop anytime you want me to. We could do something else. You want me to continue? Okay, I will then. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforth to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The words "strange," "singular," and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy. I cannot read. I'm very sorry, darling. Truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have been cut from the trees and thrown, through an open window, into my chamber. This had probably been done from the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames, and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portrait as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentient that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. I see your face, darling. I don't think that's a very good idea either. It sounds like a very bad idea. One night, as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. This doesn't sound like good news, does it? No, it does not. I continued my caresses, and, When I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature. A certain sense of shame and the remembering of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it had also been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed, in a high degree, that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinency which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring up upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet, and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber, in this manner, to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own. Yes, even in this felon's cell I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the nearest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but, by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had, at length, assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now a representation of an object that shuddered to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of the hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me, a man, fashioned in the image of the high God. So much insufferable woe! Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former the creature left me no moments alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent internally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates. the darkness and most evil of thoughts, the moodiest of my usual temper, increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while, from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep steps, and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting, in my wrath, the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference, into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. It's all right, darling. It's only a story. Here. That better? You're starting to look sleepy, and then I read that part and you looked scared again. I'm sorry. It is all right though, because I'm here, and I will keep you safe. Nobody's going to touch you but me. Only I get to touch you, and no one else gets to hurt you. Understood? Alright, let me continue then. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by the fire. At another I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as of merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered through the rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair, with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minute care. I looked around triumphantly, and said to myself, "Here, at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." You know, it's very hard to hide a body without other people finding it eventually. What do you think? Not that I've ever tried. At least, if I had, I wouldn't tell you. would I? My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed in the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe, or to imagine, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during that night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises for ever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. I have a bad feeling about this. A very bad feeling. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigations of the premises. Secure, however, in the most inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom, and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word, by the way of triumph, and to render doubly sure that their assurance of my guiltiness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicion. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, with the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my wife. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb. By a cry, at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly with the throats of the damned in their agony and of the demons that exult in damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, though extremity of terror and awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiled at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotting with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. And thus ends the story. That's it. That's all there is. How are you doing, darling? Are you sleepier? Yes? That's good. What did you think of that story? Was it scary? A little? It was more troubling than scary, wasn't it? You have a cat. I don't think your cat is like that. Your cat is very sweet. Yeah. You have a very sweet cat. I should get a cat. What do you think? Not a black one? Oh, we'll see. We'll see. We'll have to see. But I promise that if I get a black cat, I won't kill you and I won't stuff you in the wall. Is that a good deal? How can I promise that? That's a good point. That's a good point. Promises can be hard to keep, but you're too cute to kill. Yeah. I would never kill you. I would never stuff you in a wall. Out of everyone, you're the last person I'd want to stuff in a wall. Although, I wouldn't mind locking you in here. You could never leave. That I wouldn't mind, but I'd need you alive for what I wanted to do. Stop teasing you. Oh, but it's so much fun. Oh, that's right, that's right. I'm trying to help you go to sleep, not wake you up. Right. Shall I read another story? You would like that? Right. This one is entitled The Fall of the House of Usher. Alright. You ready? You want another kiss before the next story? Oh, you're so needy. Alright, here you go. Happy? Is that what you wanted? Alright. Now go back in. We're gonna read another story. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but, with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of the half-pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the most sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me into the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple from the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond a doubt, There are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us. Still, the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depths. It was possible, I reflect, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression, and, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled lustre by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder more thrilling than before, upon the remodelled and inverted images of the grey sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and the eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. It's an interesting line of thought there. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him which, in its wildly important nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me, as his best, and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this, and much more, was said, it the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. This doesn't seem good, darling. What do you think? You have a bad feeling about this? You should. I mean, we know from the get-go where these stories are going to go. and yet it's so fun to feel a bit worried about it. Don't you think? You agree with me? Yeah, as you should. Would agree with me. Although, as boys, we had been even intimate associates. I can't read. I guess I saw the word intimate and I got distracted. That's your fault. Hey, don't look at me like that. Keep reading? Alright. And you keep trying to sleep. Right? Don't be mad at me for being distracted. You're being distracted too. Well, I'm not the only one being distracting. Go on. Oh, you're so silly. Although, as boys, we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late repeated deeds of munificent I don't know all of these words. I promise I'm smarter than this most of the time. Yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, of the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth, at no period, any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency, I considered, well running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one and the long lapse of centuries might have exercised upon the other, it was this deficiency, perhaps, of the collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name which had, at length, so identified too as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the peasantry who used it, with the family name and the family mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down with the tarn, and had been deepened to the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the conscience of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to exhalate the increase itself. Such I had long known, as the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been for this reason only that, when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself, from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous, indeed, that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that upon the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves, and their immediate vicinity and atmosphere had no affinity with the air of heaven, which would have reeked up from the decayed trees, and the grey wall, and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapour, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of the old woodwork, which had rotted for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of the scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceivable fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction, until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of healthy step thence conducted me, in silence, through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I had encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I had already spoken, while the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, the sombre tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or to such as which, I had been accustomed from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge, and how familiar was all this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellised panes, and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remote angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung among the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. On my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. I glanced, however, at his countenance, convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling of half pity, half awe. Surely, a man had never before so terribly altered, in so brief a period, as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit that the identity of the one before me with the companion of early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverous of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curvature, a nose of delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking, in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion of the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggerations of the prevailing character of these features, and of the expression they were wont to convey, I lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous lustre of the eve, above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face, I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidation, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, when the animal spirit seemed utterly in abeyance, to that species of energetic concussion, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow-sounding elocution, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard, or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, and of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady, It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although, perhaps, the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses, and the most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain textures. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from strange instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror I found him a bonded slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise, shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their result. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon the intolerable agitation of the soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect. In terror, in this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals, and though broken and equivocal hints, enough singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitions, impressions, and regards to dwelling with his tenanted, and whence, for many years, he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence whose sorry, don't look at me like that. I am allowed to miss a word. Supposititious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated, an influence which some peculiarities in mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought about the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long continuous illness, indeed the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I cannot forget, would leave him hopeless, and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such a feeling. A sensation of stupor oppressed me, as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly to the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emanation fingers which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent although transient affections of the partially cataleptical character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed, but on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, She succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain. The lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. And thus, as a closer and still intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if it inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects, was the moral and physical universe, and one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey any idea of the exact character of the studies, or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous lustre over all. His long improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I held painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of von Weber, from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness at which I shuddered the more thrillingly, because I shuddered knowing not why. From these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to adduce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, the mortal was Roderick Usher, for me at least, in the circumstances that surrounded me. There arose out of pure abstractions, without the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which I felt ever yet in the contemplation of the certainly glowing yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly, in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, with low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout, and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, and with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was, perhaps, the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth, in great measure, to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptus cannot be so accounted for. They must have been, and were, in the notes, as well as in the words of his wild fantasies, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with the rhymed verbal improvisations, the result of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I had previously alluded, as observable only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it, as he gave it, because, in the under of mystic current of its meaning, I fancied that I perceived, for the first time, the full consciousness on the part of Usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled The Haunted Palace, ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus: "In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in the sweet day along the ramparts plumbed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moved musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne were sitting 𝑙𝑜𝑎𝑑𝑖𝑛𝑔, and his glory well befitting the ruler of the realm was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travellers now within that valley, through the red litten windows, see vast forms that move fantastically through discordant melody, while, like a rapid ghastly river, through the pale door, a hideous throng rushed out forever, and laugh, smile no more. I well remembered that suggestions arising from this ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest in the opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much as on account of its novelty, for other men have thought thus, as an account of the pertinacity with which he maintained it. This opinion in its general form was that of the sentience of all vegetable things, but in his disordered fancy the idea had assumed a more daring character, and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of an organization. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the great stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collection of these stones, in the order of their arrangements, as well as in that of many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around. Above all, in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn, its evidence, the evidence of this sentience, was to be seen, he said, and I here stated as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the wells. The result was discoverable, he added, and the silent, yet importune and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him what I now saw. What he was, such opinions need no comment. I will make none. You asleep? I can answer that question. So peaceful. Breathing? Yeah, I will be breathing, but I will be quiet. I think you're asleep. If you are awake and just almost asleep, don't answer. Right? Our books, the books, which for years had formed no small portion of mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with this character of phantasm. We pored together over such works as the Vervent et Churches of Grisette, the Belfinger of Machiavelli, the Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim by Holwerk, the Chermontsey of Robert Flood, the Jean d'Aulnay, I don't know how to pronounce these names, of de la Chambry, the Journey into the Blue Distance of Taiek, and the City of the Sun of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small octavo edition by the Dectorium Inquisitorium by the Dominican Aymeric de Gournau, and there were passages in the Pomponius Mela about the old African satires and the Agathons, over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of the exceedingly rare and curious book, in quarto Gothic, the Manual of the Forgotten Church, the Vigile Monumortuum, Secundum Jeromum Ecclesiae Mogentine. I could not help thinking the wild ritual of this work, and its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intentions by preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment, and one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one that I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, a certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men, and the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase, on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as the best but a harmless, by no means unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened without our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light, lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used, apparently, in remote feudal times, for the worst purposes of the donjon keep, and in later days, as a place of deposit for powder, or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor, and the whole interior of the long archway through which we reached it, and were carefully sheathed with copper. The door of massive iron had been, also, similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having disposed our mournful burden upon trestles within the region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin, and looked upon the face of the tenant. Striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and the usher, divining, perhaps, my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested no longer upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had laughed, as unusual in all maladies of strictly cataplectic character, the mockery of a faint blush of the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and, having secured the door of iron, made our way, with toll, into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now some days of biting grief had elapsed, and an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eyes had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if of extreme terror, richly characterized his utterances. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled to the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours, in an attitude of profound attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. And it was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me, by slow yet certain degrees, the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was, especially, upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the donjon, that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all of what I felt, was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies, which, tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and, at length, there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and, peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me, to certain low and indefinite sounds which came, through the pauses of the storm, at long intervals, I know not whence, overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable. I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen, by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but few turns in this manner, when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterwards he rapped with a gentle touch at my door, and entered, bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but, moreover, there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. "And have you not seen it?" he said abruptly, having been staring about him for some moments in silence. "You have not seen it, then? But, stay, you shall." Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements, and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was, indeed, a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew, carrying from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I said that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this, yet we had no glimpse of the moon or the stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning, but the under surfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous acceleration which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. "You must not, you shall not behold this," said I, shuddering, to Usher, as I led him, with gentle violence, from the window to a seat. "These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank of miasma of the tarn. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read, and you shall listen, and so we will pass away the terrible night together." The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst, of Sir Lancelot Canning, but I had called it a favorite of Usher's more in sad jest than in earnest, for, in truth, there is little in its uncouth and unimaginative prolixity which could have interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremities of folly which I could read. Could I have judged, indeed, by the wild, overstrained air of vivacity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, to the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at the well-known portion of the story, where, if thrilled, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. Here, it will be remembered, the words of the narrative read thus: "And Ethelred, who was by nature of doughty heart, and was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who, in sooth, was of an obstinate and maliceful turn, but, feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rise of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and, with blows, made quickly room in the plankings of the door with his gauntleted hand, and now pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder, that the noise of the dry and the hollow-sounding wood alarmed and reverberated through the forest." At the termination of this sentence I started, and, for a moment, paused, for it appeared to me, although I had at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that from some very remote portion of the mansion there came, indistinctly to my ears, what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was, beyond a doubt, the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for, amid the rattlings of the sashes of the casements, the ordinary commingled noises of still increasing storm, the sound itself, in itself, had nothing, surely, which would have interested or disturbed me. I continued the story. But in the good champion Ethelred, now entering with the door, was sore enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the maliceful hermit, but, in the stead thereof, a dragon of a scaly and prodigious demeanour, and of a fiery tongue, which sate and guard before a palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and upon the wall there hung a shield shining with brass of the legend enwritten, Who entereth herein, the conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh, withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, and the like whereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that, in this instance, I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say. A low and apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, the most unusual screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek, as described by the romancer. Oppressed, as I certainly was, upon the occurrence of the second and most extraordinary coincidence, by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting, by any observation, the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although, assuredly, a strange alteration had, during the last few minutes, taken place in his demeanour. For a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought round his chair, so as to sit with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could but partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, yet I knew that he was not asleep, from the wide and rigid opening of his eyes as I caught a glance of its profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with this idea, for he rocked from side to side, with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Launcelot, which thus proceeded. And now, the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield, and of the breaking of the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously into the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth varied not for his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor, with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at that moment fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic, clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movements of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity. But as I placed my hands upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering manner, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it. Yes, I hear it. I have heard it. Long, 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 many times, many hours, many days have I heard it, yet I dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am. I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not that my senses were acute? I tell you now that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not. I dared not speak. And now, tonight, it thrilled. Ha ha ha. The breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield. Say, rather than rending her of coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the copperhead archway of the vault, oh, whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying up to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footsteps on the stairs? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet, and shrieked out his syllables, as if in an effort he was giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door. As if in superhuman energy of his utterance, there had been found the potency of a spell. The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed drew slowly back, upon the instant ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of the rushing gust. But then, without those doors, there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, then, with a low, moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From the chamber, and from the mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath. As I found myself crossing the old causeway, suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. From the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, which I had before spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and the dank tarn at my feet flowed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. And thus ends the tale. I think you are asleep. I'm glad you are asleep. I was afraid that I'd keep you awake. You look so cute and peaceful while you sleep. I'll leave you to it. Good night, darling.